In this lesson, we will be adding in the endpoint where we can fetch all of the course progress for a specific user. And so we'll be able to use this in our application to load up that initial state into our Pina store so that we know which lessons the user has completed and which they haven't. So first we need to figure out, what do we want this endpoint to do? In our database, we've got a bunch of different records that show us which lessons the user has completed, but we don't want to return that specifically to the UI because that raw data isn't as useful to us. It doesn't tell us how much of the course they haven't completed, although it is useful for telling us which ones they have. And if all we wanted to do was use this mark complete button, that would be fine because we could show if they've completed it, and if we don't have that data, we'll just assume that it's false. However, in the next lesson, we want to add in a feature to show the percentage completion of each chapter, as well as the percentage completion of the course as a whole. And so we need to know how many courses, how many lessons they have yet to go. And we want to be able to do this in an easy way. And in theory, we have all the data in the front end that we need to calculate this. We've got the course outline and we've got the progress data. We can combine this together on the front end, but we're going to combine it on the back end instead because we'll be able to create an endpoint that's more useful in other places if we wanted to get this data. It is a bit of a judgment decision here on whether we do that logic in the client or on the back end, but for now we're going to do it in the back end. So first we need to create our API endpoint, and we'll create one at API/user/progress because we're going to get all of the progress for a specific user. We're going to tackle this in a few steps because it does get a bit complicated. So we're first going to protect this route because we can't get user progress if there's no user logged in, of course. And then we're going to find all of the lesson progress objects that match this user's email and are for this specific course. So we're building in the functionality to eventually add in more courses, but for right now, we're going to hard code in this course ID since we only have the one. And we'll add in this nested select here to grab the slugs for the lesson as well as the chapter. Then the next thing that we're going to do is fetch the course outline so that we can then combine all of the lesson progress data with the course outline, and we can get a whole overview of how far this user has come in completing the course. So to do this, we use our $fetch that we use on the client side, but because it's isomorphic, we're able to also call this on the client or on the server side. So we'll make use of our course meta endpoint that we've already created, and we'll fetch that course outline. But keep in mind that because of the optimizations that Nuxt does, instead of making an actual HTTP request, it can directly call that method instead of going through all of those HTTP layers. So this call, because it's an internal call, is more efficient. Our next step, now that we have these two sets of data, is to marry them together to create our full progress outline. First, we need to create some types that we will use in the course. Our first step in combining these two data sets together is to create some types that we will need. So we'll open up our custom types here, where we only have one for now. We'll paste in this chapter progress and course progress type. So this syntax, all that it's saying is that we're going to have an object where all of the keys are going to be strings and all of the values are going to be Boolean. So we're not really dictating the shape of this, other than that it's an object. And then for the course progress, we're doing a similar thing, but we're saying that for every value, it's going to be a chapter progress type. So this describes the nested structure of our course progress, where the top level keys for the object will be the chapter slugs. And then within that, we're going to use the lesson slugs to access the Boolean values, whether that lesson is completed or not. So now that we have these types, we can go back to our endpoint and we'll import those types along with the existing types we have from our meta endpoint. Then I'm going to come down here and paste in the logic to combine everything. And so what we're doing is we're creating that nested object that we just described with our types. We go through each lesson and we're going to make sure that we find the lesson that matches the given slug for the chapter and the given lesson slug. And if we can't find a lesson progress, then we will just default to false. So that means we get each chapter specified with either the value found in the database or false. And then we do that for every single chapter in the course. And then we have our full object, which we then return at the end of the event handler. And now that we have this course progress type, we can update our Pina store to use the type. We can go from this any type to course progress. We can also now add in to our initialize function the code we need to fetch all that initial data. So we'll get rid of this comment and then we'll paste in this code here. And what we're doing is stuff that we've seen before. We're going to use the useFetch composable to hit our progress endpoint, but we're going to make sure to pass in the cookies along with that so that we can pass in our logged in state. And then once we get this user progress data, we're going to update the progress here of this ref. Now we use this pattern of first initializing the ref without any data and then updating that so that we can take this ref and pass it back to our components. So now that we've got all this stuff going here, let's refresh our page so that we get it in action. So why don't I create an entirely new session just to make sure that we're not caching any data or anything like that. If I hit that endpoint, then we can see that it loads and it shows that this lesson has been completed, as well as the very first lesson in the course. But if I go to our database now and I update these directly in the database, let me set these to false. I'll make sure our session storage is not caching it. Well, I guess it wouldn't because we're not using the useFetch with cache. Here, we're just using straight up useFetch, which is done intentionally because we don't want to cache that data. And you'll see that if I load this now, these two lessons are loading the correct data from the database. Of course, I can switch them back just by clicking on the UI, as you would expect. And there you see that we have now changed them back. So now we have complete end-to-end from the UI, writing to the database, and then retrieving from the database back into our Pina store. We've seen how to use Pina to keep track of our course progress, how to use this initialize pattern to initialize asynchronous data in our store, and how to use this toggle complete along with this optimistic update, which we can roll back if the request fails. And in the next lesson, we'll see how we can add on to this to show the course completion percentages in the UI to give a bit of a better feedback to the user as to how far along they are.